So we are excited to welcome you, Samar, to our Femme Futurists Society conversation series. It's really fun watching them build and to see how we are in some ways so aligned in our thinking and yet so different in how we're expressing it or how we got here. And so it's really fun to get to know each of us. So I've been practicing your last name and I keep butchering it. So tell us beautifully your last name.
So my name is Samar Hechaime, and let's keep it.
I've been trying to practice it, and we have not gotten it nearly as beautifully enunciated as you. But thank you for joining us. You're joining us from London today. Although that one of the things I find so fascinating about your background is the total global experience that you've had, and not just in consulting or speaking. I mean, not just in terms of like flying in and doing a project or speaking, but you have worked around the world doing this work. So I hope that during this conversation we get to take peeks into things that you've been doing around the world. So thank you for being part of this.
Thank you for inviting me to join.
Totally. Well, and again, and part of this whole thing is to expose the thinking from around the world. So I think it's great that it's not just US-centric, that we get to have folks from London. So thanks for, I don't even know what time of day or night it is for you, but thanks for being here. Let's jump in terms of, you are a co-founder of Agora Consulting and have built a really fascinating practice that weaves from architecture all the way through design thinking into futurism and the way in which that we, how do you want to sum up kind of how you describe your role in the sort of futurist landscape? What would your description of who you are be?
Well, I come from the world of built environment and the architecture, but in the last 10 years, I've moved away into more strategic transformation. But the key thread between my work back then and the work that is now is a human-centric approach. And what led me to this is from the built environment, where we were fixing the issues of the built environment or translating what the elements of the built environment through what we were doing in wayfinding or experience design. I was questioning, why aren't we doing that human-centric approach at strategic levels? So what I'm focusing on now is basically using a human-centric approach to create strategies. So why don't we design our strategies to be human-centric from the get-go? And by doing that, they would be innovative and transformative, whether they're incrementally innovative and transformative or drastically. And that is what we call radical human disruption, or human-centric disruption. Because we talk about digital disruption and we talk about all kinds of disruptions, but why don't we actually use look at the human element as being the disruptor? Right. And that is, and then when we're looking at the human element is not one homogeneous, and it is not about the average. It is about a beautiful diversity and
plurality is one of the words I use around that, but yeah.
Exactly, it is multidimensional. And the thing that got me to think about this is also a lot of the emerging from the world of design and design thinking and all that. We see a lot of the focus going towards designing for the individual. And all the experience, whether it's digital or physical, focuses on the experience of the individual. But by doing that, we reinforce all the silos and isolate the individual in that experience, and thinking there's a amazingly perfect moment of experience, which never happens. There is no perfect moment of experience. The beauty of experience in it is its cumulative and the story that you get to build around it. And the story is only happening when the individual is in relationship to the collective. So what I think is the missing key thing is to take the design thinking and the creative mindset to the collective. And to do that, it is to take it to the strategy rather than to the tactic. And shifting completely the mindset of instead of designing products and then retrofitting them to fit into the business model, why don't we start by creating a framework that is built around the ecosystem of users in their visible and invisible aspects, and then create that framework will allow us to create products that will be much more fitting both for the individual and the collective.
So can I just jump in for a second and just sort of clarify? So that is sort of the tenets of design thinking, right? That has been what has, in some ways.
The tenet of design thinking is tenets.
Yeah, I never get the right word. I make up words all the time, so who knows?
It's human-centric, but that is where it focuses more on the individual human centricity rather.
Okay, so the distinction you're making there, right?
Yeah, so when we're talking about design thinking, let's say you're using design thinking to create an app, and a lot of the tools of design thinking that have evolved through the years, because design thinking isn't anything new. It is thinking like designer, which is starting by understanding the issue and then designing for it and implementing. That is the with people at the center of it. But we can take that to the top levels, and instead of just thinking about it in a problem-solving model, which when you start in problem-solving, what you do is think about it from the perspective of your expertise. So if there's a problem on congestion on the road, what you would think a traffic engineer would say, let's widen the road. And a transport engineer would say, we need more buses or trams or public transport. But when you start thinking about it from that collective and that interconnectivity, you start thinking in a much more different way, and you start thinking, what is the challenge? But once you start saying, what is the challenge, and reframing the question, you need to understand, who am I talking to? And by saying, who am I talking to, you reframe, where is that question coming from? It is like that thing that they talk about, it's an elephant. Have you heard that thing about it's an elephant?
It actually came up on a project that we're working on recently that feels exactly the same way. So yes.
Yeah, and everyone will be like, oh, if they're blindfolded and they touch the tail, it's a snake. Or if they touch the trunk, it's a hose. But it takes stepping out to see the whole picture, the holistic approach, and going in a 360 manner to see it's an elephant. And that is what is the idea of agora envisioning. Agora is the collective, the Greek democratic idea of a collective, and envisioning is not just having a vision, but building a vision and going towards it and creating that future vision. So the name is indicative of what is the idea of agora envisioning. And that is comes along from having worked in the built environment, trying to solve problems at the end of the line, then moving into experience design, and then moving into service design, and then finally realizing we're still talking at the wrong level. We need to talk at top levels so that the top levels can hear what's going on the ground. So it's not a top-bottom.
So define top level for us. What do you mean by that? The people who are...
about the C-suite, I'm talking about the board, and I'm talking about governments, whether it's local government or it is national governments. And you can kind of see where this is really needed in moments of crisis like we're facing today. And the ideas that I've been working on are about how do we, through that interconnectivity, are able to break the silos. Because that is where the whole models we live in today are very much linear and binary. And you have that if then, yes, maybe kind of approach in everything that we do. And that is, we see that in the form of the GDP, we see that in the form of risk management, we see that in everything. And that has created that lean model, which drives me nuts. It's like, let's go for efficiency rather than effectiveness. Let's have an outcome that we can monetize and rather than value and impact. And then came this COVID-19, where it really proved that the binary and the linear thinking gets shattered very quickly, because by making everything lean, you remove the redundancy and you remove the fat that can handle the shocks. And by creating a lean system, you're focusing on the average. You're not focusing on the collective, because you make it lean to fit what you think is the most common denominator. But it's actually the lowest common denominator, not the collective shared.
So I want to pause this conversation for a second and either zoom out or zoom in. I'm trying to figure out which way I want to go, because part of me is like, when you talk about this, I think of it as systemic thinking, right? That's a lot of ways which we describe this idea of collective and being able to zoom back and see the whole elephant and understand how things are interconnected to one another, right? But when I zoom in, it sounds like your work is much more about how do I achieve this idea of systemic thinking. It sounds really great to say when you think about civic design, or even if you're implementing a new healthcare solution, whatever it is, that you zoom back and you understand the system. But I don't think that people, A, have the capacity or the tools or sort of enough experience, certainly, in being able to think that way. So if I zoom in on your work for a minute, Samar, where do you think that the real development or capabilities need to be cultivated in order to be able to do that successfully? Is it about building better interpersonal relationships instead of stepping outside of our, known environments? Is it about, more curiosity? I mean, I'm just curious what you think some of the solutions are, or the tactics are, I don't know how you want to describe it, to getting at a better understanding of this.
And that's where I thought that design thinking can come into play, because it is a tactical approach that you can, as you just rightly said, people are very unsure about uncertainty and dealing with uncertainty. They need a rule book. And the rule book in this case, it is in the framework, is the design thinking framework. You could use the tools that have been developed through the years in design thinking as a way to sort of see a progress and have a metric. Because that is, before COVID started as well, you were seeing also the emergence of ESG, and that as a metric, moving from CSR to ESG. There's been now companies need to become much more environmental.
They describe CSG, because I use a different term.
ESG, it is.
Oh yeah, environmental sustainable governance.
Yes, thank you. And that is, they're talking about it still a bit on the sidelines of how the organization is.
Well, and I think it still leaves out a bunch of things like social equity and a bunch of other pieces of it that I think are not included in even that understanding of ESG. And so, there's a bunch of acronyms that we keep sort of moving down the line to.
And that is because we're still making it more tangible by removing the what is uncertain about it, which is the human element. So I figured we have the system, which everyone understands from their own perspective, their own experience. So let's give an idea, healthcare. So you've got in the healthcare system, there are multiple systems in there, inside of that. You've got, let's take the American model. You've got the pharma, you've got insurance, you've got actually the world of work, because they're very much intrinsic to your access to healthcare or not. And healthcare has been pushed to the care end of it. So rather than it being well-being, it is about care and primary.
Sick care, right? Yeah.
Secondary and tertiary. So as it doesn't try to get you to be in good health, it tries to react to whatever you're dealing with. And then within that internal system of the healthcare, you've got doctors, you've got nurses, you've got the cleaning staff, all of that. And now we've got an added thing, which is the digital, which we're seeing a lot of it emerge in during the pandemic. A lot of these don't even have digital records and record keeping. So data is a player that hasn't really taken its place yet. And that, if you then go down to the individual, so this is the system level, and that system influences the behavior of the individual. Let's say a lot of people don't go to a doctor and don't take sick leave because they will be penalized in their work and they would lose their income if they take sick leave. And if they lose their job, they would be basically left without an insurance. And if they go to their job and they're sick, especially in a situation of a pandemic, that's going to grow exponentially within the organization, rather than, so that is where interconnectivity comes into play. So healthcare then plays a role within the world of work and the economic world of work, and then also within education. But it all boils down to that individual. But the healthcare system segregates that individual into parts and thinks about that individual in terms of head and heart and blood and whatnot. And we even build that so intrinsically into our system that our hospitals are built in those layers. And there's no interconnection there. But if we go back towards the origins of healthcare from Galen and Ibn Sina, the traditions that were in place all the way until the Victorian age, they were much more interconnected and about the balance. Galen had the wrong idea, but the right idea about the balances of the humors. And the humors had to be in balance, even though the whole idea of humors is it's been refuted, but the idea of balance had been refuted with it. And if we balance that individual and take into account that individual's behavior within themselves, but also within the context of their family, and how that relationship to health and well-being is within the context of the family, then we start ripple effect backwards and outwards.
Right.
So if somebody if the leadership starts understanding that interconnectivity, they can start changing the system to fit that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna challenge for one moment and just say, philosophically, totally agree. I think that and it'd be interesting to know more about some of the consulting work that you've done, because when you try and talk about it from that perspective, it's really hard for them to understand, right? It's like, again, we've had sort of a similar conversation in some of the work that we've done with big, huge multinational corporations that are trying to solve what they think is a small problem that's actually connected to a much bigger system. And so the question is, how do we orient their thinking? So you can try and talk about it philosophically. Talk about it. It's always interesting to use medical metaphors for some of this stuff. But sometimes it's also about, I've simplified it, Samar, and just said, put the human at the center. When you put the human at the center and really start to think about putting the human at the center, you just make different decisions. You prioritize things differently. You start to see, again, that this is connected to that. We shared once in a previous conversation, the example, right, about the child who's not learning well at school. And it's not just because of the teacher, right? It may be because they didn't have breakfast that morning. It may have been that they came from an unstable home. It may be that they didn't have reliable transportation. It may be that they have a learning disorder. It could be, there's a whole range of things that factor into whether that child is prepared to sit in that seat, right? Currently, in some sort of seat. And actually what we're seeing, to your point again, in the pandemic, is just how broken our understanding of any of that is, because most people don't even have that infrastructure in a very secure way. So I guess I'm just thinking, can we get a little tangible for a moment? Can you just give us an example and then pull back to the story you want to tell? Because I just think getting clear about those.
Well, it's about the stories, and you're absolutely right by giving that example. Because when it goes up to top levels, it becomes about the numbers. But if we can tell the stories, and this is where design thinking can come into play, because you can then create the persona using the tools like persona development, and then using those to tell the life's journeys, and all to be able to make concrete in one way or another those individual stories, but also how they interconnect with each other. Because at the end of the day, the system is irrelevant, because it all comes in together at the level of the individual. And that is where
that spirals into. So I think, again, the point for me, I think the question always, where's the point of intervention? Like, if you want to solve this or create an opportunity, to your point, not just solve old problems, but create a new opportunity, where do you start in the sort of?
Well, that is where, let's say, if we're being approached about, we're kind of been approached about different things, but not the example of healthcare, let's say transportation and mobility. And the question would be, okay, where is the future of mobility going? And that is a very valid question right now, and everyone is kind of thinking about it from the perspective of the product they're developing, whether it is electric vehicles or selling bikes for individuals or shared economy. You see all of that playing. And in order to come up with what is your intervention, you first need to understand where it plays within that whole system. So mapping the system is a first good step to say, what are the different players on that plane, specifically on that plane of mobility? And then what do they engage with? So in the case of COVID, for example, when we saw right now what is happening is mobility and how much we can move around within our neighborhoods has shifted completely what we can access. And that said, that is affecting the supermarkets. So let's keep it at the level of those two things. So when we're approached by the head of the supermarket saying, okay, we've seen a complete shift in how people are buying at the moment. What do we keep and what do we shed moving forward? And that is where mobility, for example, comes into play, because the change that has happened at least in London and within the UK, and I think around Europe it has happened the same. I'm not quite sure about the US because it's a much more car-oriented economy. But in the more transit and pedestrian-oriented economies of Europe and the UK, the way of buying and retail has completely shifted during the pandemic. So the question has been now posed, do we change? What do we change? What do we keep? And so that's the first question. And then to map that within the neighborhood, because it's a 15-minute, 20-minute kind of connection. What can you access by foot or on a bike to get to your store? For example, that has shifted. Instead of going once a day to the store and getting small buys, the family has shifted towards buying for the week and doing much more. Those who can, because it's also where your users would differ, those who can have now shifted to home making and home baking, and that has affected also the way of work. So from one question of the retail, you can start seeing the interconnections. Now, the retail, the head of a retail organization is not going to solve all of these issues. But it is good for them to be able to map them out, because one change on one level is going to affect them in another level. So if they map this the way I'm imagining this to go forward is bringing in data and machine learning, because if you can build that system in a way and multi-layer the systems, then you can bring in data and aggregate the data in different ways to feed that and make these systems and journey maps live. And once you can do that, it's sort of having, if I can get you to visualize that, it's like a command control on a ship, on an army ship. And you've got multiple, at least the old-fashioned way, you had multiple glass layers of where you could map out your radar and where are your on one level, where's the where are the submarines? Yeah, submarines, thank you. And where are the ground ships and all of that. And once the captain sees all of them together, they can see where's the threat, where's the opportunity, and where would they go. Now, that doesn't take into account, for example, somebody falling asleep on the button and hitting the the release button on some bomb or something, and triggering a ripple effect So that these are crisis moments. But the idea that started working on when the pandemic happened is, how do we take all of this and use it into something that changes our economic model, because we're all interconnected. And that struck me, that we're actually, the economic model that we have, that is the flow of goods and services, and that back and forth of labor and then goods and services, is flawed because it is extracting, it's not value generating, and it is linear, and it keeps going in one direction rather than actually being interconnected. We've seen the circular economy and the donut economy, but to me, they're still, even they're going around, they're still in a way linear. And then there's an image that I kept working on through the years, and I use a lot in my presentations. It's the idea of the constellations. Now, in the constellations, you have one set night sky, but the night sky gets shifted in the perception. So it's the data in a way, but the cultures understand that data differently because of the questions they ask differently of that constellation. And they group and cluster the stars in a different way that would relate to who they are as a culture. So the Greco-Romans understood the stars as Orion and Scorpio and the gods and it was a way for the individual to be able to navigate with that collective, the group, as well as between the unknown, which is the sky and death and all of that, and the known, which is the earth. And to me, that was beautifully portraying how you can create something that balances the individual versus the collective, and the physical versus the intangible, the virtual. If we take that to America, you have the bears and foxes and wolves, because the American Indians had a very different relationship to the stars. If you go to India, it's a very different, and it struck me. It is an
great example.
So if we look at the economy as a constellation economy, whether it is within an organization itself or interconnection between the organizations within a country or a city, or even across borders, we see then that you can create a non-linear but an interconnected constellation that can keep shifting and moving. And if you happen to have a crisis moment like the one we just lived through, it doesn't collapse completely, because it can reform and reshape. And that is where it becomes around how does that story moment shifts. And that happens also when we remove the story from the stars. When the navigation started going just scientific and all of that, that relationship disappeared. And that's unfortunate, because then you had the individual in relation to this whole vast universe, earth and sky, and disconnect from the culture. You remove the individual into their own setting, and there's no using of that storyline.
Question. I mean, that's one that honestly, if we had time, we would dig into that over lunch one day for hours, because I think it's really fascinating to say. On the one hand, it's great because by community, you had a shared understanding of what this meant. When I say fox here, and I say Orion there, and someone else says something there, like we have within those communities a shared understanding. If you just say Venus and you just say Mars, which now globally we have an understanding of, it kind of wipes out sort of, it homogenizes on one level, but it does make it easier to do global. Right, because now we all look at it from the shared scientific understanding that that's Venus, regardless of whether that's part of this constellation or that part of this constellation. So it's an interesting thing to understand. So just help me understand for 1 second. When you talk about, I understand shifting interpretations, because I think a lot about when you talk about data and a data layer, it's really important, because that data isn't just data. That data is an interpretive collection.
Yes.
What questions you choose to ask, what data you choose to collect, how you choose to analyze the data is very discriminatory. It is not empiric, as much as we like to believe that it is. I think it'll be a long time until we get really clear on that. So But if you're thinking about on the shifting sides, like, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how you use that constellation thinking in terms of, back to your idea about mobility and understanding, like within an ecosystem, how I should be, I'm sorry, seven thoughts at once. I think about if I was an urban planner right now and I had been building for additional highway lanes because we just thought traffic was going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And all of a sudden this pandemic happened and we're now remote working, right? And the remote schooling. And now, at least half of the traffic, if not more, has been removed from the roads. All of a sudden you go, am I still trying to build more roads, or am I really trying to increase the spending toward a 5G network, or toward the broadband is just available throughout my entire city? So this goes back to the systems level, right? Where is the connectivity? And you're trying to solve it from a connectivity standpoint as opposed to a mobility standpoint, right?
And that is where that story moment will allow you to build that system. So the system, as I was saying, is you can map it and you can say who are the players, but it's that interpretation through the story of the group and the individual. So group and the individual will write the story. So you can have the same elements: scooters, cars, electric vehicle, oil cars and electric vehicles, as well as public transport. All
as well as broadband. I'm not going to put that in the list of things, but yes.
Because broadband is a highway. All are elements within that mobility that you find in different places around the world. It's the grouping that differs. So in one place you have more reliance on the public transport. In another place you have more reliance on the car. But even, let's say, in Texas, which is one of the bigger stances, you go towards Austin or Houston, and even central Dallas, you have smaller networks of public transport within the bigger car system. We're not talking European scale. We're talking.
I was gonna say it's a little anemic around here, but yeah.
Yeah, but interestingly, before COVID, the mayor of Dallas was trying to see how they can create a much more removing people from the car, at least within central Dallas. And they were working on it as, again, in terms of electric vehicles and scooters and bike mobility, as far as I've seen. And I say as far as I've seen because I'm just kind of reading around. I'm not involved in that project in any way, shape, or form. If you take that into consideration, okay, you've got the mobility elements, but then look around the cost of land and the sprawl of Dallas. The guy you referred to me in our first conversation was talking about something very interesting about creating within Dallas these, or suggesting to create campuses where the big organizations can create an interconnected campus where education and healthcare within the work environment comes into play. So when you're driving towards work, you're taking your child with you to the school because the school is in the same campus. And that to me is sort of embodying the old model of Europe, which is a more interconnected neighborhood model.
Loose, is this what you're talking about?
Yes.
The 2036 project? Yes.
Yes, 26, yeah, exactly. And that, they're still thinking about it in a way of bubbles. But what happens when we take that bubble and that bubble and that bubble and connect them together? And that is that constellation, because you can redraw the lines differently and tell the story differently. So if, let's say, a company that's a pharmaceutical company interconnects with a retail food grocery company, and you get food closer to the place of healthcare and well-being, your relationship of yourself and food and well-being changes because your access changes. Mm-hmm. Now, most of the time, company executives say we're only giving what our clients want, but that's not necessarily true because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You give them that, they adapt to it, and they ask for it more. Doesn't mean that is what they want, and what is good for them. So if we stop and say, we're not looking at customer experience. We're not looking at internal experience. We're looking at the human experience. Then it takes into consideration, when we're doing the persona and the understanding of the human element within that system, the different roles we play as humans within the same system. So we're not just one thing or another. Mm-hmm. And if you take that, so if you can map out your system, let's say the food system, the transport system, and then you start seeing the vertical relationships between them, and how they connect is the human. It's like a game of snakes and ladders. And you can actually map it out. What I've done in one of the projects with the Saudi government is map it out like a massive game of snakes and ladders that we printed in a huge poster, and you could actually move things around. Because the moment you gamify these experiments and experiences, you take away the binary, there's a right and wrong answer. And you say, let's play around and let's see, what can we do? What if? And it allows everyone to say, what if? So that's number one, remove the stigma of there has to be an answer. Well, the what if can be momentary as macro and micro as well. And what you do on a macro can change the micro. What is also interesting that I've experimented with is not only the persona as something that is a line and a story that is rigid, but enabling the people who are doing the designing. And I use the word design in a very, very broad spectrum. So somebody who is creating the transport system or creating the retail system or all of that, they're designing something. So that's design with a big D. If we allow them to understand that ecosystem of user and embody the user, so they become the user, you shift the perspective and you start understanding how you can create something through the needs and the eyes of that other person. You're not creating it for you. Because if you look at most of the stuff that is coming out of Silicon Valley, it is basically scratching an itch of the young 20 to 30 young men who have no responsibilities, are well off, etc., etc. It does not take into consideration the rest of the population. But they have amazing capacity to do that, but their lack of diversity at the table doesn't enable that broader
Again, it's not because I think that they're necessarily like hampered or wrong. It's just anybody that you had in an homogenous team, regardless of what age or what gender or what background, it's going to be homogenous in their thinking, regardless.
Yeah.
So how do we broaden that? Yeah.
Yeah, to broaden that, we have to do two things. One, to get different diverse people at the table, but also to enable people to see through somebody else's eyes. Yeah. And once you do that, that can happen once we've understood who are the different users within the ecosystem of users. And there's going to be invisible users and there's going to be visible users. And once we reveal them, we can kind of tell their stories and how they relate to each other. Because it's not a story that's in isolation, it's in relationship. And that then you can create a framework. So back to the mobility. Okay, we've revealed what are the tools of mobility. We've revealed who are the different players. The role of the leadership is then to create a framework and say, what we want to achieve is this vision. Let's say part of the vision is minimizing emissions. Part of the vision is to also create something where you combine short distance versus long distance transport, as well as a shared economy with an ownership economy. If this is your vision, this is your framework, then you can allow everyone within the team to create something that relates to that ecosystem of users that uses these, and it becomes an interplay between all these elements. Right. It's not a one set solution.
Yeah, I agree with it. So I guess I'm just saying it's Samar, and there's so much that is packed into your brain and the solutions around these things. And as we round the corner to this conversation, I'm really curious about where you are applying this thinking right now, what you are really focused on trying to create right now. Like if you take all this body of knowledge and work and the things that you've been seeing and the ways that you've been mapping things and creating tools for people to be able to access this thinking better. Where are you most like diving in?
Right. I'm looking at the questions of mobility, of healthcare, and basically the model of retail. And all of that will then, and I'm thinking around these because I'm sitting here watching what's going on, and I'm thinking what can be done with that. That's where this paper that I wrote around the Constellation Economy came into play. Because once you create that model, it can be applied into any of these. And if you want, then you can get two organizations to work together. And that's where I would like to go, where we can create interconnections between different organizations. And there's an appetite right now that we're seeing because people or leaders have seen that they're not able to solve things on their own. And they need an interplay between them and governments. And you can see that it has happened somewhat in France, where the government has bailed out Air France and KLM, but told them we only bail you out if you become the greenest airlines and you don't compete with the train system. But then, so that is the government influencing the organizations. But then there are two promises or pledges that came out of the French organizations. One is international and one is French national, that said to the government, we want you to accelerate the Paris Agreement, reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto agreements. And this is where it becomes very interesting, and that interplay starts happening, because companies that are pharma and food, FMCG, and airlines and airports and trains and all of that are all part of the pledge. And then it's going to be part of the government's response to say, okay, where do we give you the platform for that to happen? Now, it is kind of happening in Paris, where the mayor is saying, we want to transform the city of Paris to a 15-minute city, where all of the city, everything that you need should be accessible on foot or on bike, so non-emitting modes of transport within a 15-minute radius. And once we start doing that, it changes the whole model. So these are not necessarily, these are things that I'm actually looking at and trying to play around with, without them being necessarily yet projects that are per se engagements. So what I would like to do next is to call up and say, throw it out like a call to arms of let's start these conversations. And I would be I would be very excited to have these conversations with whomever, different organizations that want to reshape the constellation internally, because the constellation is not just between organizations and the government and multiple not cities, countries. It's also internally. So it goes from you can break the silos of the organization by creating a constellation model inside the organization. So I would be interested to talk within an organization and help shape that constellation internally to shape the future of where they're going, whether it's the future of mobility or future of retail, as well as if they're really bold and want to do that, the next step, what is the future of interconnecting these things together?
Yeah, I was just going to say, even that question about the future of this versus the future of that doesn't take into consideration the interrelationship between all that and the connectivity. And we're seeing that right now. Those lines are not discreetly drawn, right?
Not at all.
Life. It's the future of living. It's not even, even the future of work is not the right question actually to be asking, in my opinion. So,
no, because what is work? And when I hear that answer, that question of what is the future of work, it seems to be focused primarily on white collar and the thinking of what is it called? The thought economy?
Knowledge. Yeah.
Knowledge. Thank you. So, excuse my brain moves in multiple languages.
I know. So how many languages do you speak? 4?
I speak 4 languages.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can only imagine which files your brain is pulling from when it's trying to figure out the word submarine or non-worker. So yeah, I I'm happy to be your American fill-in here.
Thank you. Because in Lebanese culture, we speak three languages in the same sentence. So if you're ever in Lebanon, I hope you visit soon, you hear people talking half the sentence in French, half the sentence in English, half the sentence in Arabic.
Wow.
Actually, that's three parts. It's very hard. It was one of the hardest things for me to focus on one language. When I first moved to Holland and I had to focus on one language, meant that I was removing a capacity from my brain, right, which then I translate that into when I'm speaking and I can't find the words, I describe things. So I might not sound linguistically very academic, but I'm describing things.
Yeah. No, but again, this is why I think your gift is so much more, and why I think these conversations are so rich. Again, you have worked all around the world. You've lived in all these places around the world. You have these multicultural inputs into your brain, literally, and are able to see these things from a more systemic place and understand how this framing, this framing versus this framing can work or not work together. That I think is really, really rich in the work that you bring and the perspectives that you offer. So I love the diversity of it, but I love being able to have I wish that I had a VR equivalent where I could go into your brain and sort of see it the way that you see it. Because I do think that there's a really, really big gift, and I think being able to share that and articulate with those of us who have a more narrow point of view is a challenge. But thank you for plugging forward on that challenge, because I agree with everything you're saying around the systemic nature of these questions and how we approach them and how we build more interconnected thinking around it. I do think that's
I hope this has made it. I know sometimes when I'm talking, it sounds very much like esoteric and big ideas. I hope I managed to translate it into what can be tangibly something that we could do about it. And it is in all the projects that I've done, which are very, very big scale, and I always get the question of how do you deal with this? It's like, well, break it down into the individual, because that is understandable, and then go outwards and then go back in. And it's an interplay. It's like it's like watching a ballet or an opera. You have moments where you have a solo, but you have moments where it's the choir and the whole
ensemble
stage.
Yeah.
And then you have moments of dance, and you have moments, and that is where the most interesting ballets and operas are the ones that are actually both ballet and opera together. And they tell those stories on so many different levels. And that is where I think when we bring back these things to our way of thinking, and it becomes qualitative rather than quantitative, we'll be able to change those systems towards something much more humanistic. And if the system needs them to be quantified, we can quantify the qualitative, because it's about the value we create, not about, and the impact, not about the monetary value, because the monetary value will follow and it's going to be incremental. And you don't have to give the other.
I could not agree more. And that's what I think, again, is so fascinating about these conversations, is that at the end of the day, they sort of all end up centering, or often center in this exact understanding around putting the human at the center, about being about value creation, not just value extraction, right? And about being able to, from a more systemic place, that have more longevity and more sustainable impact, and just hold us all better moving forward. We talk a lot about building a better next, and this is the opportunity that we get to have now, as we get to re-look at all this and think about the role that high tech and high touch meet together. We've talked about those words for years, but I think it's really coming to fruition now when you realize what you can influence through technology and data, and how you hold the human at the center of that.
And if you bring that with optimism, and you'd say to people, this is where, if you ask me what I do, I am a future shaper, because I don't think of the future. I mean, with the future is what we shape on a moment and by moment. And to be able to shape the future, bring everyone along the ride, but give the people at the top levels that visibility to see those stories, to be able to make influential decisions. And that's that.
Well, and even to question the structure of a top system, I think that will be that will shift and change over time too. And
that becomes more a fluid and a fluxus model, but you still need at least some decisions to be taken and somebody to take responsibility on some levels. But instead of it being a triangle or a pyramid, it becomes much more, again.
Well, yeah, the way that I described it, there's somebody else I talked to recently too who said the same thing, is that we think of it much more as a solar system, right? It's back to your constellation economy, but the idea that there is some gravity at the center and there are things that spill out of it, but the fact is all those roles, it's not considered, it doesn't have as much hierarchical value when you say top or bottom, right? When you have center and outer ring, even the person in the outer ring or an organization or contributor from the outer ring has something very valuable to add to it, but it just has less weight in terms of whether or not, you know, it carries responsibility or not. And so organizing thinking in that way, I think, gives us a different way of being able to name these things. I think the way we label them and the way we name them is a big input into how we organize with them. So
exactly. And to me, that means that we shift from being linear to being four-dimensional.
Yeah.
It's not even three-dimensional, it's four-dimensional, because then you bring culture and that mosaic into play, and then you bring back those relationships that become so beautiful to view, because they're just fluid and beautifully, enough of saying beautiful, but you know what I'm saying.
So I use the word extraordinary over and over again. I'm with you. I mean, and that's just it. I think that the last thing I think we would leave for anybody who has taken the time to spend with us to listen to this interview is that there really isn't a very optimistic and a really hopeful point of view on this. We sit in a moment that feels really dark, and we try and understand what the world's going to look like 6 months from now, or a year from now, or even 10 years from now. And I think that when you really look along the horizon, those of us who do this work and get to spend this much time thinking about it, and with the people who are building it, have a tremendous amount of hope for what is on the other side, and activate like a call to go and do it, to go build it.
And it is up to us at the end of the day, because if we sit there and wait what is going to happen, we're going to find ourselves in a world that is that idea of dystopia that we also see in science fiction and all that. But if we take up, okay, what can we do? And
that's why I say the solar system, even if you're on the edge and you're just making conscious decisions every day about what you purchase, or where you put your attention on media, or the conversations you have with other people, or the way that you speak about things, that has an impact onto the whole rest of the solar system.
Everyone has a voice. It's whether you choose to use it or not, and how you choose to use it. And sometimes you choose to use it by abstaining. Sometimes you use it by voting with your footsteps and going towards a retail store or not. And sometimes it is by collecting. If we look at what's going on in Africa, for example, how Rwanda has come out of the massacre, and how it actually has been the country that has now currently the equality in gender equality in government. Yeah. That's because women said, okay, well, it's up to us. And we just don't sit back, and we'll do something about it. And they started doing microeconomies, and they started creating the interconnection that enabled Rwanda to heal and come back out of the situation that they were in. And that's where you need a bit of courage and a bit of not being blue in the face and saying, well, I don't need a rule book. This is amazing. Yeah. And that is
we can have the things. Yeah, absolutely.
So. Yeah. So I'm looking right now at something that is inspiring me, and I'm looking at, okay, I spend a lot of time during the day reading news and trying to collate news from all over the world, and it gets sometimes too much on my brain to be able to understand the now. But I discovered in the last 2 weeks a PBS American Experience show about the American presidents. And I realized we kind of need to look at the backwards to be able to understand where we got to now. And especially at the moment of the creation of the United States. So George Washington, Adams, Maddox, and Jefferson, and how they formed the United States.
My
because
favorite part of history. Yeah.
they had a tabula rasa in a way, and also FDR during the World Wars, after World War I, during the Depression and World War II. But what was interesting, what was even more interesting than reading or watching, because I watched and then I read about them, is about the women in their lives. And that is where I'm getting the most inspiration. So for example, Abigail Adams has inspired so much in my brain about how to think about laws and on a greater scale, but how they affect the individual in the home. And she actually asked her husband to take into consideration the ladies as he's writing the laws, because that is something that has been forgotten and so much is taken out of them. Then you look at Dolly Maddox and how she's shaped the role of the first lady. So those invisible figures have, or Eleanor Roosevelt is actually a very big player in shaping the New Deal and the Fair Deal afterwards. And we forget them.
Yeah.
So that's been my inspiration lately. There are stories, but there are stories to history that we don't see because we look at it through one lens.
Right.
And
a certain way. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Let's shift the
lens. That is the opportunity to shift that portion of the story, at least as we move forward. Right, and invite everyone in, because I really do think a portion of what we're trying to do here is not just amplify women's voices, but also encourage women to be much more a part of the building and the shaping and the analyzing and the storytelling and the structures of what comes next.
And reading the structures and the systems and elevating the data to be much more four-dimensional so that we can use it and build the world of our future.
So you and I think talked about this before, but I'll just throw out this one name again, and then I will close so that this doesn't become a marathon series. Is Nora Bateson. You would really love her work around warm data and contextual data and understanding the relationship portion of data, so that it's not just that they're discrete and always about trying to replicate. It's also about taking into consideration, to your point, the past, the present, the future, the relationship, the liminal space between it. So,
and for example.
Right, I know we talked about the Invisible Woman, and this goes back to the work that we're doing with Rayanne and about building a different way of looking at economic modeling and yardsticking. So to be continued. This we will do this. But these conversations can lead to another one, and we are trying to figure out ways also for people who have questions and then want to know more about your work directly, where they could potentially figure out how to reach you and find you. So we'll have links on the site. Will you give us a link to the Constellation Economy paper? I think that would be a really interesting.
It's not been published yet, and if anyone would like to work on where to take it next or publish it in an official paper or whatnot, please do. At this point, it's still sitting on my computer, and I need to.
That is potential in the making right there. So thank you so much, Samar. I appreciate your time. I'm so grateful we've gotten to know you through this whole initiative. This is the fun part, is the connections that we get to make and the fact that we get to reach out to one another and curious and openly understand each other's work better. So thank you.